Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Dr. Mariam Motamedi Fraser about her book titled Dog Politics, Species Stories and the Animal Sciences, published by Manchester University Press in 2024, which investigates some pretty big important questions like, do dogs belong with humans? We have all sorts of scientific accounts about the species stories of dogs, and we're going to get into what that means, that talks about dog-human relations. But what does that actually mean? What are these stories telling us? How might we want to be more critical in our thinking about them? And also thinking about these ideas of kind of what science is telling us around all sorts of questions of species, animals, behaviours, politics. There's a whole bunch of things here. So I'm very excited to have this conversation. Mariam, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Miranda. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I'm very pleased to have you. Could you please start us off by introducing yourself a little bit and tell us why you decided to write this book?
Okay. Why I decided to write this book? It's a good question, really, given that most of my academic career has been focused on really quite abstract concepts and theories. So, for example, the book prior to this one, which was published in 2015, was called Word, Beyond Language, Beyond Image. So it's a book about non-linguistic word relations. So there is actually, in fact, quite a lot of connection between that book and the shift that I made very shortly afterwards to animal studies, but that's another story, so I'll leave that. So with regards to this book specifically, I think it's probably a classic animal story in the sense of growing up with animals and especially dogs, but not thinking very hard about my relationship with them beyond, the kind of classic thing, how much I love them, that kind of thing. But then I took Monk, who's the dog that I live with now, to puppy classes at the Dog Hub in London, which is where I met Susan Close. And Susan basically changed my relationships with dogs quite dramatically. She had a very different understanding of dogs to anyone I'd ever met. And she also invited me to volunteer at the Dog Hub. And so from that point onwards, I also came into contact with a lot of dogs that I didn't live with or that my friends didn't live with, and a very wide variety of dogs, socially speaking, because the Dog Hub takes private clients, but it's also part funded by the local government authority, which is Camden in London. And simultaneously to all of that, Susan also encouraged me to do an advanced diploma in canine behaviour and management. And the first part of that course was very science-oriented. That wasn't unfamiliar to me because the earlier part of my career had been mainly in science studies. So basically, completely by accident, I became rather saturated in the dog world, or at least the London dog world. And that made me want to write a book about dogs. That's it, really.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. It's always interesting to hear the origin story behind a book. And continuing our sort of foundational beginning of this interview, can you tell us about the two assumptions that the book rests on and how you developed these?
Yeah. So I wanted to write a book on dogs and about what I'd been learning since my encounter with the Dog Hub. But when I tried to do that, I found I just couldn't get past the concept of species. And that was surprising to me, given that species is not exactly a concept that anyone would intuitively associate with domesticated dogs or captive dogs, as I'm going to call them, not least because they're usually highly individualized. So basically what I'm saying is I don't think there are many owners who think of their dogs in terms of species. If anything, most domesticated dogs are probably understood through the lens of breed. The reason I couldn't get past species was because I felt that it was everywhere in this idea that dogs and humans have a special, if not unique, relationship with it, the so-called dog-human bond, and that the capacities for that relationship, and more fundamentally, the history that gave rise to those capacities, was in fact definitive of dogs as a species. So having seen quite a lot of dogs on the ground at this point, I was thinking about that story all the time, and how commonly it was invoked. But I was also beginning to doubt whether it was actually true. So the main assumption of the book is that species, even when it's not immediately evident, or if it's disguised, remains a really core element in thinking about dogs, about animals, even dogs. And the second assumption is that this is not a good thing. And it's not a good thing for lots of reasons, some of which I develop in the book, others of which I've been working on since finishing it. But in the book, I focus on the practical price for dogs of the naturalization of the dog-human relationship, and at a more abstract level, on the ways that species concepts serve to erase the significance of animals as individuals. And I use that expression a lot in the book, the erasure of animals as individuals. And again, I recognise that might sound quite counterintuitive with regards to captive dogs because they're so individualised. But frankly, woe betide any individual dog who doesn't want to go along with the idea that the dog is defined by the dog-human bond.
Okay, so those are some very useful ideas to lay out early in our conversation. Thank you for that. The other, I think, really key thing to discuss at this point is sort of where some of these ideas are coming from. You talk in the book that the sciences have been considered the main authorities on the study of animals. Can you help us understand why that is and why this actually might be a bit problematic?
So science has hegemony over animals for lots of reasons, and it's difficult to know even where to start with why that is. And it's, in fact, an area that I intend to do much more work on. Just to say here, you could trace the roots of the division between the sciences and the humanities to Descartes' mind-body split. And of course, this institutes human exceptionalism. All creatures can be understood in terms of complex machines, except for humans. And that's what was so radical about Descartes' work at the time. And I'm drawing on Jessica Riskin here. Not that he thought that living creatures could be understood in terms of machines, which was not a completely uncommon idea, but that he ditches Aristotle's vegetative and sensitive souls for plants and animals, but retains for humans the rational soul. This distinction has huge implications for the relations between animals and humans, but it also shapes the relations between humans, bearing in mind, particularly in the light of the development of scientific racism over the following 2 centuries, that not all humans are fully situated on the human side of the divide. So you have this revolution in perception, as the historian Keith Thomas puts it, that gradually marginalizes non-scientific ways of knowing and engaging with animals. So people who live with animals, people who work with animals, local knowledges, indigenous knowledges, and so on. And this revolution in perception does this in part, and this for me is probably the most interesting bit, by defining animals in terms of their biologies, physiologies, and eventually post-Darwin, their evolutionary histories. And there are lots of very interesting accounts, some of which I discuss in Dog Politics, of the disciplinary battles that took place over the study of animals and which discipline was going to be able to legitimately lay claim to them. But broadly speaking, the allocation of animals to the life sciences side of the sciences humanities divide doesn't really seem to have ever been in doubt. More recent developments, not only in animal studies, so taking animals as subjects of research in the social sciences and humanities, but developments in the sciences themselves as well, seem to be calling those divisions into question. So the divisions, say, between mind and body or culture and biology and so on. In the public domain, though, science maintains its authoritative grip on animals. So, for example, Justina Vlajarczyk, in her very wonderful book called Genealogies of Obedience, she argues that today, wherever science goes, dog training follows. And that has been my experience, that most dog training books and pamphlets and so on refer to some kind of scientific theory to make their cases. One thing I should say, or would like to add, is that I'm not against science or anti-science in any way. In fact, I value it highly. My problem really is with the lack of reflexivity that often goes along with it, and that is supported by a broad, popular, unquestioning faith in science, and also its very rigid commitment to quite narrow concepts and theories like species, as if this were the best or the only way to explain animals, to understand animals. And you just have to imagine that if all human life was going to be accounted for by just a handful of disciplines, which all share roughly the same methodologies and epistemologies, we would consider that to be a moral outrage. And we'd also consider it to be completely outrageous if human research subjects didn't contribute to knowledges themselves, about themselves. And then just another final qualification. I also don't think there's any reason to believe, in fact, there are plenty of reasons not to believe, that ordinary folk, in inverted commas, necessarily know animals any better than scientists do. And Nicholas Delon has argued, for example, that people who work with animals, and we could add here people who live with animals, are highly motivated to read their signals in ways that benefit themselves. And there's a growing body of important scientific work on dogs, for example, which illustrates just how problematic owner assumptions can be. And Alexandra Horowitz is especially good on this. And I've seen that myself in the Dog Hub. So that was a very long, scattered answer, but that I think that, science has historically, through many, many different modes and methods, not just intellectual, gained authority over the study of animals and still holds on to that authority in their own eyes and in very many other people's eyes as well today.
That's definitely helpful to understand. And that's what we do here, right? We look at history and information critically with nuance. We try to avoid just accepting the stories we've always been told. That's why we have authors like you come on and help us think through these things. So thank you illuminating that in this instance. I wonder if we can now turn to, obviously, a key part of the book, species story, right? We've mentioned species a few times. It's in the subtitle of the book. Can you tell us more what you mean by a dog species story, maybe with an example?
Yeah. So the concept of a species story, which is really central to the book, is basically my effort to try to bring some reflexivity to the concept of species. And by that, I mean to draw attention to the political work that species concepts do in organising animal-human relations. And by species story, I don't just mean any story. I mean a scientific story that's specifically indexed to how a group of animals have become what they apparently are over evolutionary time. So how has this group of animals, which are now collected under have a species name or species classification, come to be who they are? And the reason that's important is because it foregrounds particular specific qualities as definitive of the species. And even more importantly, it implies that those qualities or capacities or characteristics can't in any sense, in any real sense, be transformed. So in short, they've emerged over a long period of time and they aren't going to be changing anytime soon. So if I give you an example, when the classical ethologist Konrad Lorenz looks at a mole, and when he looks at a mole's forelimbs and claws, he sees a creature, in his words, who needs earth to dig in. When scientists, or at least scientists today, look at a dog, they see a creature who needs humans. Now that claim is based, that dogs need humans, is based on justified on three grounds. First of all, that dogs were the original domesticates, and this means that their domestication precedes the agricultural revolution, which is when most other animals were domesticated, or went through the domestication process. Second, that the speciation of dogs is connected to, if not synonymous with, that domestication process. And third, that the conjoined speciation and domestication of dogs puts them in a unique relation to humans. So to unpack that a bit, basically this story of domestication assumes, usually, that dogs didn't have a species identity of their own prior to domestication. So it's not the case that dogs were dogs and then they were domesticated. It's that dogs were wolves and would presumably have remained wolves until they were domesticated. And this idea that dogs are speciation, or the becoming into a species of dogs, is the idea that it's synonymous with domestication is significant because if it's true, it puts humans right at the heart of dogs as speciation. And you can fiddle around with the edges of that. You can ask whether domestication was purposeful or not, on whose part it would have been, the dogs or humans, whether it was domestication or co-domestication. But at the end of the day, the claim is that there have been no dogs, and therefore that there will be no dogs, not for the foreseeable future anyway, without humans. So there are other stories that bear down on animals and on dogs. But given the authority of science, like we've been discussing, species stories usually represent themselves as the bottom line. They're the yardstick that defines the range and limits of an animal. And then in the second chapter of the book, I spend a lot of time looking at the scientific evidence for this species story, dogs as species story, across a whole range of disciplines. So how proof of dog speciation, domestication was established, what evidence exists to support it, what roles dogs might have played in disrupting it, and so on. And the evidence, honestly, is rather tenuous, and many scientists would admit that as well. And part of the reason for that is because theories of speciation, the ones that scientists are talking about, when they're scientists are basically trying to account for events that in the case of dogs, for example, occurred anywhere between 135,000 and 8,000 years ago, depending on which theory you go with. Yet, these stories are hugely influential. And in fact, I'd say the influence of dogs as species story has been growing steadily since the late 1990s, which is the period when the study of dogs in and of themselves really took off in science, when canine science really kind of became much more fast-paced, and Alexandra Horowitz describes it in terms of a big dog paper boom. And that translates into popular books on dogs and training books. You know, when you pick up a training book or a popular book, they almost inevitably start with some version of dog speciation, or dogs as species story, as I call it, and then justify their claims from there. And that really affects the lives of dogs in a concrete sense, as I'm sure we'll come on to say. The now very outdated idea, and very few people would support this idea, that the dog is really a wolf in disguise, has justified terrible treatment of dogs on the grounds that if you don't dominate them, they'll take over as the pack leader. And these views are still kind of quite common. And I remember my own mother shouting at the dog when he lay in the doorway between the living room and the kitchen, saying that he was controlling who was coming in and out of the room. And she'd use the word, Kite's trying to be the pack leader. When really, my guess is that it was something as benign as a breezy place to sit. And one of the ironies of that pack leader theory is that it's not even true of wolves. So the whole idea is based on a misconception about how free roaming wolves live, because the studies were based on wolves in captivity. Anyway, at the moment, the dog species story is less about wolves and more about this unique bond with humans, which apparently explains a lot of dogs' characteristics, like how they look, their excellent communication skills, the fact that they attend to what humans are attending to, that they understand pointing, gestures, and so on. But I received an email just 3 days ago giving notice of 2 recent scientific studies that show that coyotes across North America have the musculature to make what one set of the authors in these 2 studies calls puppy dog eyes. Now, the whole puppy dog eye thing is a huge part of dogs as species story. It's seen to be an important part of how dogs communicate, perhaps uniquely with humans, how they secure human attention, perhaps have even developed maximum cuteness at the very moment that the dam wants, in inverted commas, a human to take care of her offspring, and so on. The scientists who have done the coyote studies, they don't say this is a challenge to the story of the dog-human bond. Of course they don't say that. What they say is that their findings challenge the idea that puppy dog eyes developed through domestication. And that's important because it's the domestication part of dogs' species story that is currently the root of the so-called dog-human bond. So they're basically suggesting that this musculature might be a coyote inheritance in dogs that was lost in wolves, for example. So my point here is not that this coyote story is any more true than any other species story, but the point of it is that it indicates that dogs as species story is really told with unwarranted confidence. And yet its implications for dogs are so big. They're enormous.
Let's get into some of those implications. Obviously, you've given us a few examples already, but can you tell us more about how these species stories are tied to particular behaviours or behavioural expectations that dogs today are living with?
Yeah, so as I've been saying, the reason dogs as species story is important is because the story of dogs is evolutionary becoming, so how a dog is understood to have become a dog, contributes substantially to our expectations regarding what a dog is expected to feel today, how they're expected to behave, and what kind of treatment of them is justified. So, for example, the problem with dogs as species story is that it turns dogs who have legitimate problems with human social life and human environments, into problem dogs. So fearful dogs, aggressive dogs. And as a consequence, it's the dog who has to change, more medication, more socialization, rather than the ways of living and the relations that the story authorizes. And I mentioned socialization because it's quite interesting. It's often perceived to be the cause of problem dog behaviors. A dog hasn't been socialized enough or has been socialized badly, and the solution. So the solution is better socialization. And in the book, I've got quite a lot to say about human-controlled socialization. I say human-controlled because obviously there's also dogs' socialization of themselves, and socialization occurs in lots of different ways. But I've got quite a lot to say about human-controlled socialization, basically because it seems to indicate that for something that's apparently entirely natural, the dog-human bond, it requires an awful lot of work and effort on the part of both dogs and humans to cultivate. And socialization is one of the ways in which this is done. So if it's all right, I'll just say a few words about socialization. I won't say anything about the origin of socialization theories here. It's in the book. But basically, it's socialization has acquired a kind of deity status, as Karen overall puts it. And today, it's not just a practice, but it's also a science in itself. So as a science, the purpose of socialization is essentially predictive. So how can we predict which puppies are likely to grow into adult dogs who will meet the criteria for, say, laboratory work, military work, assistance work, companion work, whatever? And also, how can we avoid breeding dogs who display what owners consider to be intolerable behaviors? And the reason that's important is because when an owner identifies a behavior as intolerable, that often leads dogs to be abandoned or killed. And one of those intolerable behaviors, of course, perhaps chief among them, is disinterest in humans. And the touchstone for my book is actually a dog called Beth, who's described by Harlan Weaver in his book, Bad Dog, who was euthanized for precisely this reason, he thinks, her disinterest in humans. So there's that big science going on. It's incredibly detailed. I can't emphasize or stress how detailed that science is, science of socialization. As a practice, socialization, I would say, essentially creates dependencies in dogs and then offers them the tools, which are often inadequate, to try to navigate it, creates dependencies on humans and dogs and then offers them the tools to navigate it. Very few domesticated dogs are in a position to refuse human-controlled socialization. They're not in a position biologically, behaviorally, physically, socially, not in any capacity at all. So I would situate socialization within a broader scheme of violence. At the same time, however, and especially given the experience that I've had through the Dog Hub, I'm not suggesting, I should be clear that I'm not suggesting that socialization should be abandoned as things stand right now, because lack of socialization has really serious implications for a dog, not only in terms of relinquishment and death, but also in terms of a life lived, among other things, in anxiety and frustration and fear. So, for example, fear. In evolutionary terms, fear is understood to have direct fitness consequences. So that means that if an animal, including a human, doesn't feel fear, they may not be able to anticipate or to recognize danger and risk. So that's obviously bad for them. And becoming less afraid of humans is often seen as a marker of domestication. It's an evolutionary pressure in itself. Yet it appears that a lot of dogs are afraid a lot of the time. And in fact, there was a recent Finnish study which explicitly excluded owners who were motivated to participate because they believed their dog had a behavioral problem. So this was a study that focused on dogs that apparently didn't have behavioral problems, but which nevertheless found that about 85% of them did have problems. But what's really striking about that study is that most of those problems showed comorbidity with fear. So they were linked to fear. I should say that every time I say problems, I mean it in quotation marks. So 85% of them did, in fact, have some kind of inverted commas problem. And that maps roughly onto the figure that of the number of dogs that Jessica Pierce and Mark Beckhoff estimate have behavioral problems in the US. So a lot of dogs are afraid, and unfortunately, it's quite well documented that owners are far less likely to address dog fear, or indeed dog loneliness or dog anxiety, or even to recognize these emotions, than they are to address problems that affect them directly, like aggression. And there's a dog trainer, she's a zoologist by training, but she's very widely published in the dog training world, called Patricia McConnell. And she suggests that dogs are allowed just two emotions. They can be happy when they're with us, and they can be sad when they're missing us. And that's about it. So complex emotions like fear, loneliness, anxiety, and so on, these are not really allowable or even recognized. And above all, dogs must never express anger. And to be honest, in my own experience, I am amazed how rarely dogs express anger, given the hassle that the average dog experiences on a daily basis and from which they can't escape. So an average dog in an average day, they're going to get hassle from children, they're going to get hassle from other dogs, they're going to get hassle from their owners who are going to obstruct them, yank them, shout at them, pet at them when they don't want to be petted. They're often spending the whole day waiting. They're kind of in this suspended dependence. They're waiting for food, for company, for attention. They're waiting to go out. They're waiting to go home. They're waiting to play. They're waiting to pee. All their pleasures are curbed. Don't run, don't sniff, don't eat shit, don't splash in the mud, don't roll in whatever. So, yes, socialization is this very complicated area, not just in practice, but politically and ethically as well. And what makes it all the more difficult today is that it's set to the tune, and again, I'm drawing on Justina Wlodarczyk here, as she puts it, of affirmative biopolitics. So it's a kind of technology of love, as she puts it, that privileges fun and happiness. And that makes it even more difficult to think about power, not just the power of humans over dogs, so the ability to define, for example, what's fun, but also the power relations that legitimate the idea that a dog's preference is to have fun with us. So basically, I'm saying it makes resistance to power more difficult for a dog, and it makes it more difficult for a human to recognize. I'll just say one final thing. The relationship between dogs as species story and dogs as behavior and the cost for dogs, that's what we're talking about. And since the 1990s, a lot of scientists have argued that the human social environment, so the human social environment is dogs' natural environment. So this is quite a common argument in science since the 1990s. That doesn't mean, though, that dogs are necessarily tolerant of human environments. And so there is the behavioral ecologists, Raymond and Laura Coppinger, they argue that the reason that dogs are relatively easy to adopt and relatively easy to live with and work with is not because they're tolerant of human environments, it's because they can tolerate high levels of abuse and handling. So I think that kind of says it all, and it's something to think about when we're thinking about the relationship between dogs as species story, the so-called bond, and the practical implications for dogs. Phew.
That's a whole bunch of things to think about. To be honest, I mean, there's many questions I could ask you in response to that. But the one that kind of kept coming to my mind might be because I'm not an animal studies expert. And in fact, a lot of the history that I am more familiar with is perhaps in feminist history or imperial history or decolonial history. And some of these things that you're talking about kind of pricked my ears up, sounded familiar. These ideas of having to deny one's own needs, but in a way that is not shown in ways considered problematic by those who have more power in the power dynamic. We often, when we think about this in terms of human relations, often we'll think about things like labor, emotional labor for one. Should we be thinking about dogs as laboring subjects?
Yeah, I think that is the point that you're making about the parallels are really interesting and they are really valid. And it draws attention to just how significant, and what you're saying basically helps me to insist that dogs as species story is no small thing, that it is a very serious thing, very serious claim to be making about dogs. And part of what I was interested in exploring in the book is what are the consequences of it. So obviously we've just talked about the consequences of it in relation to dogs' lives, but also the consequences of it in terms of how we think and theorize dogs and labor. And in fact, the idea about dogs as laboring subjects or working subjects is really important in that regard. I mean, we all know that dogs work. We talk about working dogs all the time. And probably a lot of people, ordinary people, again, in inverted commas, have seen or even have some experience of working dogs, whether it's service dogs or dogs in airports, research labs. We know that they use in the military and the police and so on. What's really striking about nearly all accounts of working dogs is that they often represent the relationship between the dog and the handler as the reward for work. So again, just being with humans is the reward for a dog. And that fits in perfectly well with dogs as species story. So which suggests that dogs as a species want to be with humans because that's how they became dogs in the first place. But it's a problem if the bond is both the rationale and the reward for dogs' work. So at a minimum, it's going to set the welfare bar of suffering enjoyment very low for dogs. And Renée D'Souza and her colleagues make that point in their study of conservation worker dogs. And that all of this basically really got me thinking, what kind of work is this that dogs were apparently born to do? Are we saying that to be a dog is to work in some ways, that work is somehow natural for a dog? Of course, no one's saying that the things dogs do are natural. There's nothing natural about seeking out an explosive or loading a washing machine for a dog. But it is the case that the work is represented as kind of entirely okay, because to be a dog is to be with humans regardless of what's going on. So regardless of what the dog is doing in that context, it's all just fun to be a dog. And that's just called being a dog. So I wanted to think about that more. And there are lots of theories, different theories of animal labor, but I was especially drawn to Jocelyn Pourchaires' work because she's very explicit about the role of the bond or the link, as she calls it, in animal labor. And in fact, she talks directly about the dire consequences that follow for dogs, but also for cows when that bond doesn't exist. So for her, the bond is almost a measure of how good or bad the workplace is. If it's a good workplace, there'll be strong bonds between the animal worker and the, for example, farmer. And if it's a destructive, bad place, as in intensive food farming, for example, there will be no bonds. But Pourchaires' work is a very generic theory, which is supposed to apply to all working domesticated animals. And one of the reasons why I spend some time talking about it is because I don't think that it can apply to all animals, because dogs and cows have very different species stories. Or another way of putting that would be to say that dogs and cows don't have an identical relation to the bond. So I'll give you an example of why that theory doesn't quite work for dogs. Pourchaires argues that the bond between an animal and a human is forged and cultivated at the intersection of what she calls the animals as species world and the human world of work. So there's quite a clear distinction she's making there between the distinction between the species world and the human world. And she's also clear, especially with regards to cows, which is her main area of research, that the need for recognition, for touching, for petting, and so on, none of this is natural for cows. It's not naturally a part of their species world. So, and that's really the point for her. We have these two different worlds, species world, the human world of work. And by entering into the human world of work and getting things like recognition from humans, touching and petting and working with humans, the human world of work gives cows something extra. So in this respect, for her, work for animals is a good thing. But as we've seen in the case of dogs, according to Dogs as Species stories, there's a scientific stories about what dogs are, in inverted commas. This need for recognition from humans is apparently entirely natural. So bonds or bonding is not unnatural to dogs. On the contrary, in science, it's the very definition of the nature of dogs as a species. And this claim is often made, I should say, for free-roaming dogs as well as for captive dogs. So the two worlds that Pourchaires identifies and on which this theory of whether animal labor is a good thing for animals or not turns, the species world and the human world, in the case of dogs, those two worlds are virtually the same. And that really matters because, according to Pourchaires, it's in the intersection between those two worlds that animals can acquire what she calls a second nature. In other words, it's in the intersection between these two worlds that animals have the opportunities to enjoy a larger, more expansive life than they would do without work. And her work is obviously draws on and critiques and supports in many multiple different complex ways Marx's work. So for her, she's arguing that work or labor is a route out of species life and into species being. Well, the question that raised this, you can probably see why I was so interested in her theory with this these different worlds, the intersections between them, the emphasis on the bond or the link, as she puts it, because it led me to ask, if there is no such intersection for dogs, if that distinction between species world and human world is dissolved, such that the human world constitutes dogs as species world, I've already talked about scientists saying that the human environment is dogs' natural environment, then what would a flourishing, expansive life be for a dog? How would we get there? And we don't ask that question very often. We don't ask it because we assume we know the answer. The assumption that dogs want to be with humans cuts off very many difficult questions about domesticated and working dogs' lives today. And that's why I'd argue where domesticated dogs are concerned, rather than see the bond or bonding as a reward for labour, which is how Portia sees it, I would see it as a form of labour. So the bond or bonding is a form of labour for dogs. Do we think of dogs as labouring subjects? I've talked a bit about that. The second part of your question, should we think about them in this way? Should we think of any of this in terms of labour? It's quite a contested concept. The concept of labour it's on the one hand, it's important. As Dinesh Wadewell argues, if we can understand animals as workers, then we are obliged to recognise their role in the production of value. So that's really an important thing. Plus, labour is intelligible to us as a site of political struggle. And that's a really important part of Portia's argument. But I also agree with Jessica Eisen when she argues that the concept of labour risks whitewashing the extreme instrumentalisation of animals, especially in agriculture. So for me, one of the most useful aspects of the animal labour scholarship are the tools that it offers to better understand animals' lives, and especially given my view that the bond is a form of labour. So Wadewell, again, for example, draws attention to the issue of time as a tool for thinking about the quality of animals' lives. And he notes that there's almost no limit on human exploitation of animals as time. In fact, humans, he argues, mostly assume that animals have no interest in, no need for, and certainly no right to free time. So for him, it's not a debate about how much time off an animal deserves. What he's doing is using time as a way to make the domination of animals more clearly visible to humans. And this seems especially important to me where dogs are concerned. If it's the case that the naturalization of the bond renders dogs as labour invisible, and above all the labour of bonding invisible, it also renders invisible the time that dogs devote to servicing the bond, which is in fact, for most captive dogs and working dogs, a lifetime. So another way of putting that very simply, I will finish here, is when do dogs ever get time off from being a dog?
Very, very interesting questions there with lots of implications. Of course, one of them being, as you've mentioned, kind of working dogs that are working in ways that are already more recognized in the schemas we have around labor. You mentioned, research dogs, military dogs, police dogs, those kinds of things. Thinking then about the implications of what you've just discussed for research, particularly, you talk in the book about polite research. To what extent might this be an alternative way to research with dogs?
Yeah, an alternative way for scientists researching dogs, I think. But in other respects, I also think of dogs as a test of polite research. So I can say a bit about that. But when I say test, I don't mean test in a critical sense. I mean that it's an opportunity to think further about a really helpful research model, which was developed, of course, by Vinciane Dupré. It's difficult to do justice to polite research, but in essence, it's a way of enabling animals to show what they're capable of by asking the right questions. So what would animals say if we asked the right questions is the title of Dupré's best-known book among English speakers. So you might say that species, for example, is not a very good question. Are you a dog? It's not a good question because I already know the answer. Plus, the actual dog in front of me has no part to play in formulating any answer or objecting to any answer that I might give on their behalf. So polite research basically begins from the premise that the researcher must secure the animal's interest. And this is no small thing in itself. It's kind of intuitive. Yes, we must have the animal's interest. But I think, in fact, that is already quite a high bar. So I wouldn't say, for example, that dogs are especially interested in treats, no matter how good they are at getting them. You can set up experimental situations where the dog gets a treat for doing something, and I'm not convinced that that is necessarily penetrating what dogs are interested in. So I don't think that treats necessarily help us to understand what dogs are really capable of or what really matters to them. So first of all, securing an animal's interest, what matters to them. And then it's also about setting up a research design or apparatus or dispositif, as Dupre calls it, that empowers the animal to take issue with the researcher's hypothesis and even, as I said, to object to it. This is obviously, to me, super relevant to dogs, because when do we ever allow a dog to object to being a dog? Or when do we allow the particular dog and the singular dog to take precedence over the generic idea of a dog, over the idea of Dogs as Species Story? Now, one of the ironies of Dogs as Species Story, which is supposed to account for all dogs, is that it renders the particularity of dogs or the particularity of the relationships that they're in acutely relevant. Because Dogs as Species Story is all about relationships. That's what defines the dog. But in practice, the bond is always, or nearly always, I can't think of a situation where it wouldn't be, a bond with this particular person, this particular dog. So it's quite hard to generalize about the dog in science because the results of any experiment or investigation are likely to be affected by the quality of that bond or even of its absence. And scientists are very critical of scientific studies in which that bond is abusive or the relationship with dogs are abusive or cruel or anything. And they call into question the extent to which the results are really valid given the quality of the bond. And then this problem about generalization, or rather not being able to generalize very easily, or this problem of particularities, the other side of the same coin, is exacerbated by the fact that lots of canine scientists conduct their research on companion animals. So that makes the variables even more difficult to keep steady. You've got studies of a particular dog with a particular owner in a particular country, a particular environment. It could be rural, it could be urban. Particular attitudes towards particular breeds, particular relations to dog training. There's the gender element. What kind of scientific research is this? And a scientist might well throw up their hands in despair. And in fact, they do often throw up their hands in despair. Alternatively, and this is where I come back to polite research, it's possible to lean into that particularity, to recognize that particularity and especially particular relations are an inevitable part of any research. And Dupre's point is it's an inevitable part of any research with any animal. And the point that I'm making is that it happens that, dogs are particularly ripe for this kind of view because they're already defined in terms of relations. So what a dog or any animal is capable of, in Dupre's view, is shaped by the relations in which they're situated and through which they engage. So you could just lean into that as scientists and not worry about it to any degree. The reason a scientist might not want to do that, or a conventional scientific point of view might not want to embrace polite research, is because if you take that point seriously, then your findings necessarily won't be applicable to all dogs. So you can't make sweeping generalizations about the capabilities of the dog. And Dupre is very clear about this in her discussion, for example, of Irene Pepperberg's research with the African grey parrot, Alex, which took place over 30 years. And the research apparatus that Pepperberg and Alex built together enabled Alex to do things that no parrot had been recorded as doing before. But Dupre is clear. Alex doesn't speak for all parrots. Alex tells us what this particular research apparatus is capable of producing. If generalization is possible at all, it will be bit by bit, and it will refer not to a species' capabilities, so not to the capabilities of all parrots or all dogs, but to the apparatus, to the setup. So obviously this methodological position is quite antithetical to the concept of species, which seeks to speak for all individuals, and which in fact transforms singular individuals into species representatives. So any one dog can be substituted for any other. Now, The focus of Dupre's work is on, I said there's a test that polite research is a kind of test of science, and dogs might be a test of polite research. And it's worth saying that Dupre's focuses on ethology. Quite a few of my students, interestingly, have asked themselves whether the principles of polite research could be extended beyond the research context, beyond the experimental context. Because in a way, polite research is an ethics of engagement. So they've asked questions like, can it be scaled up? Can it be a model for animal-human relations more broadly? That kind of thing. Jessica Pierce, who's a bioethicist, and Mark Beckhoff, who's a well-known canine ethologist, have written a book called A Dog's World, Imagining the Lives of Dogs in a World Without Humans. So obviously, as you can imagine, I was very interested in that book. And they seem to make a case for this. Obviously, they don't use the words polite research as such, but they seem to make a case for the kind of ethics of engagement that Dupre is proposing. But they do that by exploring the significance really at every turn, not of relationality, as Dupre does, but of individuality. So the individuality of a particular dog. And again, this is a kind of knot that I was really interested in, because the term individual, I'm sure about this really, is a term that Dupre would object to, given her focus on relationality and given that her argument that relations are productive of subjectivity and not the other way around. So even though the ethics of Pearson, Beckhoff and Dupre arrive at is very similar in practice, the theoretical or philosophical routes by which they get there couldn't have been more difficult. So the natural thing for me at that point would have just to have critiqued Pierce and Beckhoff's position, because my own intellectual milieu is not very different from Dupre. I come back from the same kind of background that privileges relationality. But in relation to dogs and in relation to this book, I just felt I just wasn't really ready to let go of the concept of the individual, especially in the context of an analysis of species categories, which are so successful at erasing individuals. So at the end of that chapter, the chapter we're talking about, which is chapter 5, I just tried to press a little bit further into some of the tensions between the relational apparatus, which is productive of an animal subject with XX capabilities, so Dupre's position, and this idea of a relatively self-contained individual. And I basically think that they're both relevant. So basically, the way that I illustrate the relevance of both is through an analysis of some particularly nasty and cruel research, which was conducted by Martin Seligman on dogs and in fact on other animals as well in the 1960s and 70s, famously demonstrating, in quotation marks, learned helplessness. And those experiments were far from polite. I mean, they couldn't have been more impolite. Yet the principles of polite research could still be applied to it. The capabilities or incapabilities, in this case, of the dogs were indeed produced by the relations established by the research setup. I referred earlier to scientists criticizing other scientists on the basis of the bad quality of the bond in an experiment. And this would be an example of one of those. And in fact, scientists argue that Martin Seligman never demonstrated learned helplessness in dogs. What he demonstrated was a kind of neurosis, which came about as a consequence of kind researchers then basically giving the dogs electric shocks. So polite research is not polite research, but all the principles of polite research can still be applied to this project, and you can use Martin Seligman project as a way to demonstrate how significant relationality is and how it is productive of animal capacities. But despite the brutality of the research, or perhaps even because they were so brutal, these experiments, it made any display of any dog's singularity all the more visible and significant. So without going into the details, it basically illustrated that not everything about the dogs and their capabilities could be reduced to or explained by the research relations. The experiences of some of the dogs before the experiments, in some cases, also exceeded the experiments. In other words, the experiments just didn't work as they were supposed to. The relations weren't kind of totalizing in any sense. But I've drifted away a bit from your original question about polite research. Basically, polite research is very challenging. I think it would be hugely useful if it was used in science. I think we can ask some questions about a much broader relevance of polite research to I'm fully kind of endorse it and embrace it. But I also think that because dogs are defined in terms of relationality, and because relationality is in some senses weaponized in relation to dogs, dogs give us the opportunity to also think about polite research in terms of its limitations and or the extent to which it can take on board singularity and, dare I even say it, individuality.
Very interesting questions raised there, alongside all the other ones we've discussed so far. Are there any other theoretical or practical implications of your analysis that we've not talked about yet that you want to make sure we cover?
I have covered a lot. I'm not sure about implications, Miranda, honestly. I think more concretized problems, maybe the identification of some concrete problems. On the theory side, I think the main thing probably is this issue of relationality, which we've been talking about. Until I started thinking about dogs, I'd say my own work has been characterized by the belief that relationality is somehow good, theoretically good, probably ethically good as well. And I'm not alone in that. So part of the kind of attraction of the concept of relationality, to go back to where this podcast began, is that it serves as a critique of the Cartesian subject. It's a counter to the Cartesian subject. And that's important. Social scientists and humanities researchers have for decades been criticizing Descartes, not only with regards to how the Cartesian subject shapes conceptions of animals, but also in terms of how it shapes racist, gendered, ableist prejudices, and so on. And that concept, that critique has acquired even more potency in the concept or in the context of climate crisis. So it really makes sense now to think in terms of relationality and interdependencies. Ecology is a relatively unproblematized, I think worryingly, scientific discipline and so on. But relationality is a very general concept, even a generic concept. And there are different forms or modes of relationality. And again, I draw on Dinesh Wadiwell, who's argued that animal-human relationality usually takes the form, in fact, of hostility and violence. So just because it's relational doesn't mean it's good. And I think it's very difficult to think about dogs without addressing the problematic side of relationality. It may be an ontological condition of the world, but in relation to dogs, the work that it does, and as I said before, the way it's been weaponized is really problematic. And it's worth saying here that the relations between dogs and humans in science, and perhaps more broadly, is not a Donna Haraway type example of co-becoming. Because, you know, some humans might certainly feel a very deep sense of connection with bonds, but even if they do, that is not a requirement of being a human. But that connection, according to Dogs' species story, is a requirement of being a dog. So that makes dogs' relationality at the species level kind of curiously unrelational. So a number of practical implications follow from there. I should be clear, my argument is not, this is not my argument, that the lives of domesticated dogs in the global north, who are the main subjects of canine scientific research, would be improved if, say, they were better socialized, they were left alone less often, they weren't considered disposable consumer objects, if we recognized owner limitations more clearly, if dogs were allowed to be more doggy, if they weren't always expected to be under control, all those kinds of things. All of that is important. And following Adrian Rich, I describe it basically as the contemporary emergency. But Dog Politics, the book, my concern lies more with what Adrian Rich calls the quantum leap. I'm more interested in the story of this special relationship that not only contributes to these conditions in the first place, but also finds them to be in some way par for the dog-human course. So it's not just that it contributes to this situation of how dogs live in, which is a contemporary emergency, but the Dogs' species story almost serves as a block to ever kind of addressing it in any radical way. For all the scientific attention to dogs, which is really massive now, it's a really burgeoning field. And for all the numbers of owners who love their dogs and would do anything for them, I'm not sure how much we really know about them or who are our so-called best friends. And then finally, there's a problem just in terms of concretized problems, problem of species, which I'm still working on. Species is central to scientific thinking about animals. It's also increasingly entrenched in debates about animals and climate crisis. But an animal is not a species. A who is not a what. A species can't resist, it can't act, it can't give its consent, it can't withdraw its consent. Yet species is the scale at which life and death decisions regarding animals are made. And I think that's a problem. So it's a bit of a rock and a hard place here, or a lot of rocks and a lot of hard places, what with the problem of species and individuals and relationality and so on. And right at the end of the book, I try and resolve it, at least in a theoretical sense, using Alfred North Whitehead's work. But to be honest, I think that was just a stopgap. That's just...
Well, nothing's ever going to be solved all at once. So thinking through the problems is definitely a helpful addition to kind of the conversation and all of our thinking. You've mentioned a few times now that kind of this continues to be, or pieces of this continue to be things you're thinking about. Is there anything you're currently working on or looking to work on next, whether or not it's a book, even if it's not about dogs, anything you want to tell us about?
Yeah. I mean, the chapter I haven't talked about much here, I've chosen not to talk about, is the one on histories of the concepts of race and of species and how they've overlapped and differed. In a nutshell, I think today, despite what's often cast as a seemingly frictionless traffic between racism and speciesism, which gets talked about quite a lot in animal studies and more broadly, in fact, the concepts of race and of species aren't politically analogous at all. That's my argument. Which is why the implications of the racialization of animals for animals, and obviously I'm looking at dogs specifically, are not the same as the implications of the racialization of humans. So in the book, that chapter is chapter 6, but I actually wrote it first, and it shaped my thinking throughout the book as a whole. And I've just finished an article which I suspect is the beginning of another book, Dear God. And this article goes back to that chapter, to the first part of that chapter, but drills down much deeper into these histories of race and species, pulling out the temporal dimensions in particular more clearly and what they mean for animals. So that's kind of sending me down the rabbit hole. I'm not sure if I want to use that metaphor. That's sending me down the avenue of addressing evolutionary theories more explicitly. So basically, I think I have a book emerging in my mind, and I think it does follow from dog politics, even though it might not be focused, or is likely not to be focused on dogs. And as I said earlier, I'd quite like to go back to that science-humanities split again with animals in mind. So that's it for the moment.
That all sounds very intriguing avenues to investigate. And of course, while you're doing that, listeners can read the book we've been discussing, titled Dog Politics, Species Stories and the Animal Sciences, published by Manchester University Press in 2024. Mariam, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you, Miranda. Thank you so much for inviting me.